The wind had been restless for days, an odd, low whistle winding through the house's narrow hallways and around the edges of the old wooden shutters. It felt like the world was gearing up for Halloween, with a kind of quiet thrill, as though something waited just outside, unseen. Our daughter, Lily, loved it. She was only 6 and already buzzing with plans. She'd convinced her mother, Julie, to help her string orange lights along the banister, cut out jack-o'-lantern faces, and bake pumpkin bread. But every time Lily and I talked about Halloween, Julie would go pale and brush it off. Every time the holiday came around, her mood would shift and she'd grow silent, a certain tightness creeping into her expression. I tried to brush it off too. After all, not everyone loves the eerie festivities. But there was something different about Julie's reaction. It wasn't just reluctance, it was something colder, something edging on fear. 2 nights before Halloween, I was heading up to bed when I noticed her standing in our room, staring at the window, her face washed in the faint blue of the moonlight. Her silhouette was stark and unmoving, as though she were frozen. The floorboards creaked as I walked in, and she snapped her head toward me, her eyes wide with something close to dread. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She swallowed, glancing back at the window. "Do you feel anything?" I almost laughed, thinking it was a joke, but her face was tense, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for something or someone. "Julie, it's just a chilly October night," I said, smiling. "Probably just the wind. It's been wild lately." She took a shaky breath and whispered, "We should leave. Just for a night or two, maybe until Halloween's over." "Leave? Honey, why?" "Lily's looking forward to the trick-or-treating and we've spent days putting up decorations." I know. I don't feel right," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "There's something here. Something dark, something waiting." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. It wasn't just her words, it was the tone in her voice, the way she seemed to shrink in on herself, her hands wrapped tightly around her arms. I'd known Julie for years, and I'd never seen her like this. There was genuine terror in her eyes, not just a Halloween prank or some ghost story chill. We went to bed, but Julie didn't sleep. I felt her tossing and turning, her breaths quick and shallow. And every so often she'd reach out, as though to reassure herself I was still there. She kept muttering under her breath, words I couldn't quite make out, her face creased with worry. The next morning, she seemed more herself, though there was still a shadow hanging over her. We went through our day as usual, pretending everything was fine. But by nightfall, the house felt different, colder and quieter. When bedtime came, Julie clung to Lily a bit longer than usual, hugging her with a fierceness that seemed to unsettle our daughter. Lily tried wriggling away, laughing, but Julie held on, whispering, "Mommy loves you. Mommy will always love you." That night, I awoke to a sound, something soft like a faint shuffling. I looked over, and Julie wasn't in bed. The moonlight cast long, strange shadows across the floor, creating a distorted, eerie glow. As I got up, I noticed her standing near the corner of the room, her back turned toward me, her frame outlined by the dim light seeping in from the hallway. "Julie?" I whispered. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. It was as though she hadn't heard me. I could see her shoulders trembling slightly, her head tilted at an odd angle. "Julie, are you okay?" Slowly she turned, and I caught a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed in dark shadows, and her skin looked pale, almost gray. There was an emptiness in her gaze, a vacancy that wasn't Julie. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a faint, shallow breath. I reached out to touch her, but she recoiled, stepping back, her eyes wild and unfocused. "Don't," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's here. It's in the room." "What's here?" I asked, feeling a prickle of unease at the base of my neck. She shook her head, trembling, her eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned, following her gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the shadowed emptiness of our bedroom. I glanced back at her, trying to shake off the growing tension in my chest. Then she whispered, "It's watching, waiting." Julie wouldn't go back to sleep. She sat at the edge of the bed, eyes trained on the door, as though expecting something to walk through at any moment. I was too unsettled to argue, so I stayed up with her, the two of us sitting in silence as the night stretched on. In the early hours, when dawn was just a faint hint of gray on the horizon, she finally relaxed, her shoulders loosening, her face softening. "Maybe it's gone," she muttered, half to herself. I sighed, feeling the weight of the sleepless night bearing down on me. "See? Just a bad dream, Jules." But the relief didn't last. Halloween morning dawned, and the air felt thick, pressing in on us with a strange, unshakable weight. Julie moved around the house in a daze, as though in a trance. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes flicking toward dark corners, the shadows beneath the furniture. Then, that evening, it happened. It was just after dinner. Lily had run up to her room to get her costume, her laughter echoing down the hallway. I started clearing the dishes, and Julie remained seated, her eyes locked on something invisible. Her lips moved, whispering something under her breath, words too quiet to catch. I reached out, touching her shoulder. "Hey, it's almost time for trick-or-treating." "Lily's..." She flinched, snapping back into focus, her face pale. "You should take her and go." "Julie, come on, what are you talking about?" She leaned in, gripping my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Take her and go. Don't come back tonight." There was a desperation in her eyes, a frantic urgency that shook me. "I can't leave you here alone. We'll stay together." She shook her head, her face twisting in fear. "It's too late, it's already here." The lights flickered, dimming for a moment, casting the room in a deep, unsettling shadow. I felt an icy chill run down my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. And then I saw it, a faint shape, a figure, moving in the dim light of our bedroom doorway. It was tall and twisted, its form shifting, its limbs stretched in unnatural angles, almost as though it was bending to fit through the frame. "Do you see it?" Julie whispered, her voice hollow and trembling. I could barely breathe, barely move. The thing stood there, a dark, pulsing shadow, its head slowly turning toward us, and then it stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step, and I felt the weight of its gaze on me, cold and oppressive. "Julie, come on." I grabbed her arm, but she wouldn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the creature, her face drained of all color, as though it were siphoning the life right out of her. It took another step forward, and Julie let out a soft, shuddering gasp. Her skin grew even paler, her features almost translucent, and I could see her eyes beginning to dull, losing their brightness, their life. She seemed to be withering, right before my eyes, her body shrinking, her skin sagging. I called out her name, my voice hoarse, desperate, but she didn't respond. She was transfixed, paralyzed, as the shadow creature reached out a long, thin hand, its fingers curling around her, not touching her but close enough that I could see her skin pulling toward it, like it was draining her, drawing her in. And then, with a final guttural hiss, it faded, pulling Julie with it, leaving only the hollowed shell of her form. Her face was locked in a silent scream, her eyes wide and empty, her body frozen in an eerie stillness. The room was silent, the air thick with the cold, lingering presence of that thing. I could feel it, somewhere just beyond the veil of sight, waiting, watching. I reached out to touch Julie's hand, but it was cold, stiff, lifeless. Lily came in, dressed in her costume, her eyes bright with excitement. She looked at Julie, then at me, confusion and fear dawning on her face. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her voice small, frightened. I swallowed, unable to find the words. "She's gone, Lily," I whispered, pulling her close, my heart breaking, knowing that we'd lost her, knowing that something dark and twisted had taken her, leaving us with nothing but emptiness and sorrow. The days following Halloween felt like an eternity of quiet horror, a thick blanket of dread draped over our home. I tried to go through the motions for Lily's sake, getting her ready for school, cooking meals, pretending life was still somehow normal, but nothing felt real. Every corner of the house seemed to hold shadows longer than they should, faint whispers that left me feeling watched, as though that thing hadn't entirely left. Lily, young as she was, sensed the shift too. She stopped asking about Julie after the first day, like some part of her, as innocent as she seemed, understood that Mommy wasn't coming back. She'd wake up at night, crying quietly, and I'd find her curled up in bed, clutching her stuffed animals, her face pale and drawn. One night, as I was tucking her in, she asked, "Daddy, is Mommy an angel now?" The question caught me off guard, my throat tightening painfully. I stroked her hair, trying to think of something that would comfort her without shattering her world completely. "Yes, sweetheart, I think so. She's watching over you." But as the words left my mouth, I felt a cold, prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if the darkness itself were mocking my lie. A week passed. Every time I entered our bedroom, I'd catch a glimpse of Julie's empty side of the bed and feel a shiver crawl up my spine. The air around the bed felt colder, like the last remnants of that entity hadn't quite faded. I started leaving a small nightlight on in our room, a faint glow to stave off the darkness that seemed to thicken as night fell. One night, as I sat up reading, trying to keep my mind occupied, I heard a faint noise from the hallway, like soft footsteps padding along the wooden floor. I froze, my heart hammering. Lily was already asleep, and the house was locked up tight. "Lily," I called out softly, though I knew it wasn't her. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear, my eyes fixed on the dark stretch of the hallway just beyond the bedroom door. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, a faint outline, almost like a mirage. The air seemed to twist around it, the darkness deepening as though it were being absorbed by this shape. "Julie," I whispered, barely daring to breathe. The figure didn't move, but I felt a strange sensation, a cold, sharp awareness pressing into my mind, filling me with a dread so heavy it was almost physical. It was her, or something wearing her face, standing there in the doorway, watching. I felt a pull, an overwhelming urge to step closer, but I fought it, forcing myself to stay where I was. My heart raced, my palms clammy, as I tried to reconcile the woman I loved with this twisted shadow in the doorway. The figure's head tilted, just a fraction, like it was studying me. And then, without a sound, it turned and moved down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. After that night, the sightings became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of her, out of the corner of my eye. Standing in the corner of the kitchen while I made breakfast, lingering at the edge of the living room while Lily and I tried to watch TV. Always silent, always watching. One night, Lily came into my room, trembling, her face pale with fear. She clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her eyes wide and glassy. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mommy was in my room. I felt a sickening wave of nausea roll through me, my hands gripping the edge of the bed as I tried to stay calm for her sake. What did she say, sweetheart?" She just stood there. Lily's voice was small, her eyes brimming with tears. She looked at me, but it wasn't Mommy. It was like she was trying to remember me. I hugged her close, her small frame trembling in my arms. "It's okay, honey. Mommy's gone to a better place. You're safe here with me." But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true. Halloween had passed, and the air grew colder, the days shorter, but the heaviness in the house didn't leave. It felt as if that thing had woven itself into the walls, the very bones of the house, like it was lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for something, waiting for us. One night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I felt an overwhelming urge to confront whatever it was that had taken my wife, that had torn apart our lives. I stood up, my fists clenched, the fear mingling with anger that had been simmering for weeks. "Why are you here?" I shouted into the empty room, my voice echoing off the walls. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a heavy stillness that seemed to press down on me. And then, a faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. It drifted through the room, curling around me like smoke. Home, my home. A chill ran through me as the realization set in. This presence, had been here long before we moved in. Somehow, we had disturbed it, and it had taken Julie as some twisted payment. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the weight of grief and anger nearly overwhelming me. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Let her go. Let us go." The darkness seemed to pulse around me, the air thick with a malevolent energy. And then, slowly, I heard the faintest of voices so close to Julie's that my heart broke all over again. It was soft, pleading, a sound of desperation and sorrow. "Help me." My throat tightened, tears stinging my eyes. I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling, grasping for something I knew wasn't there. "Julie?" I choked out, the hope in my voice wavering, but there was no answer. The darkness around me seemed to deepen, swallowing the faint traces of her voice, leaving me alone in the silent room. The final night was one I'll never forget. I had put Lily to bed, the usual terror gnawing at my insides as night fell. But just as I was about to turn off the lights, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint pressure, a feeling of being watched. And then, as I stood there, frozen, I saw her. Julie, or whatever had taken her form, stood in the doorway, her figure obscured in shadows. Her face was twisted, her features blurred, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a glimpse of something trapped, desperate. I took a hesitant step forward, my voice barely a whisper. "Julie, is that really you?" She didn't answer, but her eyes, they softened, just for a moment, like a spark of the woman I'd loved was still buried somewhere in that dark shell. "Let us go," I begged, my voice breaking. "Please, let her rest." Her form wavered, the shadows shifting around her, and for a split second, I thought I saw her smile, an echo of the warmth that used to fill our home. And then, just as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting, leaving a cold emptiness in its wake. I waited, breath held, for any sign, any lingering presence. But the house was still. It was over. After that night, the house felt different. Still haunted, yes, but quieter, like the spirit or darkness that had claimed Julie had finally found its peace, or at least left us alone. I moved out soon after, taking Lily with me, leaving behind the memories, the shadows, and the remnants of what had been. And as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her silhouette in the window, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just an empty house, standing silent in the early morning light, holding secrets I hoped would stay buried. And though I left that place, sometimes, late at night, I still hear her whisper, a faint, desperate plea that echoes in my dreams, reminding me that some shadows never really fade. I never thought the house would get to me like this. When I first moved in, I actually found the creaks and occasional bangs comforting, like signs that the place had life to it. It was a modest two-story colonial tucked in the suburbs, quiet and a bit removed from the bustle of the city. The perfect place, I thought, for a fresh start. But that was before the calling started. It happened on a Tuesday night, the middle of January. A brutal cold had settled over the area, and the wind howled like it was trying to claw through the walls. I'd spent the night curled up on the couch with a book, wrapped in blankets to stay warm because the heat wasn't doing much against the freezing air. I was just about to head to bed, letting the quiet settle, when I heard it. A voice calling my name. "Ryan." My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was nothing. Old houses, especially this one, made plenty of strange noises. I had explained every rattle, every groan away since I'd moved in. But this, it wasn't the floorboards settling or the wind creaking against the windows. It was a low, soft whisper, calling my name like it was slipping through the shadows. I sat there, every nerve in my body alert, trying to convince myself I hadn't actually heard it. I was tired, that was all. I chalked it up to imagination, the way you do with a scary movie or a bad dream, and went to bed. But then, the next night, it happened again. I was asleep this time, dreaming about something mundane. A walk through my old neighborhood, something simple and quiet, when a voice jolted me awake. It was that same voice, calling my name again. Only this time, it was louder, clearer. "Ryan, come down." The sound lingered, curling through the silence of the house, and I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, my skin prickling with goosebumps as I lay there, every part of me straining to listen. I could hear my own breath, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, but the voice, it was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had come. I lay there, wide-eyed, wondering if I was losing my mind. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, but it was fitful, full of strange, half-formed dreams I couldn't quite remember. The next morning, I was exhausted, heavy-eyed, dragging myself through the day like I hadn't slept at all. By the time the third night rolled around, I was dreading bedtime. I tried to stay awake, watching TV, pacing around the house, anything to avoid lying down in the dark where that voice might find me. But exhaustion won out. I fell asleep sometime around 2 in the morning, my eyes finally drooping shut against the blaring glow of the TV. And that's when I heard it again. "Ryan?" It was so close, as though it were right next to me, yet somehow drifting up from downstairs. The voice was deep and soft, almost familiar, but laced with something dark, something unsettling. My stomach churned with unease as I sat up, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. I wanted to ignore it, pretend it was a dream or a trick of my exhausted mind, but something pulled me up, compelled me to listen. I sat there, on the edge of the bed, every hair on my body standing on end as I strained to hear. Ryan, come down here. This time the voice was more insistent, almost pleading. Against all logic, I felt myself responding, standing up, drawn toward the stairs. The house was eerily silent, the air heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a half-asleep hallucination, but my feet were already moving. I reached the top of the staircase and peered down. The darkness seemed thicker at the bottom, like a tangible weight, pressing against the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild, erratic beat that echoed in my ears. But I took a step down, then another, my hand gripping the banister until my knuckles turned white. Each step felt heavier than the last, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to just run back upstairs and lock the door. But something else was tugging at me, pulling me down like an invisible string wrapped around my chest. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, a sudden chill washed over me. The air was freezing, colder than it had any right to be inside, almost like the warmth had been sucked right out of the room. I shivered, pulling my robe tighter around me, and looked around, expecting, I don't know, something. But there was nothing. Just the empty darkness of my living room, the shadows deeper and darker than they should have been. I stood there feeling foolish, my body tense and my mind racing. The voice had stopped, vanished into the silence, leaving me there alone, my heart still pounding with leftover fear. What do you want? I whispered, my voice trembling as it broke the quiet. Nothing answered. The days went by in a blur after that, each one slipping past as though I were in some kind of fog. I avoided the house as much as I could, finding any excuse to stay out, to keep myself busy. But every night, when the silence settled over me, that voice returned. It became a routine, a cruel, nightmarish routine. I'd go to bed, close my eyes, and wait for the inevitable. And every time, without fail, I'd hear it, calling my name, urging me to come down. By the fifth night, I was unraveling. The exhaustion was wearing me down, my thoughts scattered and jumbled, barely able to focus on anything. My hands would shake, my skin prickling with that constant sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond sight, waiting. And the worst part, deep down, I felt like I knew the voice. There was something horribly familiar about it, something that tugged at memories I couldn't quite reach, like a part of me recognized it from a long, long time ago. On the seventh night, I finally broke. The voice was louder that night, more desperate, filled with an emotion I couldn't place. There was a sadness in it, an ache that dug under my skin, making my heart pound in sympathy. And that same strange pull came over me, that compulsion to follow it, to give in. I got up, my mind in a fog, and stumbled down the stairs, each step heavy with dread. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, pressing against my chest with every step. I reached the bottom and stopped, feeling that icy chill settle over me. And then, I saw it. There in the corner of the room was a shadow, a faint, shifting outline, almost human in shape, but warped, twisted. It was as though someone were standing there, yet not quite there, like a figure trapped halfway between worlds. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a shaky step back, fear tightening around me. The shadow seemed to move, shifting toward me, and I heard the voice again, closer this time, echoing from deep inside me. Ryan, you left me. I froze, my mind racing as memories began to surface, half-formed and jumbled, flashes of things I'd tried to forget, buried deep under years of avoidance. Don't leave me. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, the voice filled with a desperation, a need that clawed at me, tearing open old wounds I'd thought were healed. And then it all came flooding back, memories of a time when I'd been different, when I'd lost someone close, someone I'd never let myself grieve. It was my own voice. The voice calling me every night was my own, warped and twisted by years of guilt and fear, a ghostly echo of the part of me that had never healed, that had been crying out all along. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the wall, my mind reeling as the shadow loomed closer, dark and suffocating. I could feel it pressing against me, filling the air with an oppressive weight, my own fears and regrets manifesting before me, dragging me down, drowning me. Please, the voice whispered, softer now, almost pleading. Don't leave me again. Tears blurred my vision, the pain and grief I'd buried for so long finally breaking free. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with silent sobs, the weight of it all pressing down on me, suffocating me. And as I let myself feel it, as I let myself remember, the shadow began to fade. The air grew warmer, the darkness lifting, leaving me alone in the dim light of my living room, my body trembling with the release of years' worth of pain. The voice didn't return after that night. The house was quiet, the silence no longer filled with that lurking dread. I felt lighter, like I'd finally let go of something I'd been carrying for far too long. In the months that followed, life returned to a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. There was no more dread at night, no more cold whispers drifting up the stairs, and the house finally felt like a home again. But every now and then, a faint echo of that voice would return, not in the terrifying, desperate way it had before, but more like a subtle nudge, a reminder. At first I ignored it, wanting to keep those memories tucked away, to finally move forward. But one night, as I sat alone in the living room, I let myself listen. Ryan. The voice was barely a murmur, like the whisper of leaves on a still night. This time, though, it wasn't pleading. It felt softer, almost peaceful. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm wash over me. The voice was mine, but it was also more. It carried memories, fragments of who I was and the people I had loved and lost. It was as if the very walls of the house, the places I had tried to escape from, were helping me come to terms with my past. And in that moment, I felt a sudden urge to go to the basement, a place I hadn't dared visit since the haunting began. The basement was dimly lit and cluttered, filled with boxes I'd never unpacked when I moved in, reminders of the life I had left behind. With a flashlight in hand, I descended, the beam casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the cement walls. The chill I remembered so vividly was gone. Instead, a strange warmth filled the space, almost like an embrace. I took a steadying breath and began sifting through the boxes. Each item I pulled out carried a piece of my past. Photo albums, letters, old trinkets from college, all reminders of times I'd long ignored. But then, in one box tucked away in the farthest corner, I found something that stopped me cold. An old journal. I hadn't seen it in years, but I recognized it instantly. It was a journal I'd kept back in college, at a time when I'd been grappling with the loss of my best friend, Dan. His death had been sudden, a car accident on a rainy night. I'd never dealt with the pain, instead burying it deep, letting it fester. I ran my fingers over the cover, feeling a surge of emotions I thought I'd buried for good. It was like that old voice had led me here, like some part of me had always known I needed to confront this pain. I sat on the cold cement floor, flipping through the worn pages, reading the words of a younger, lost version of myself. Page after page, the pain was raw, unfiltered, filled with questions I knew I'd never get answers to. And in reading those words, I felt something heavy lift, a weight I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. I closed the journal, and for the first time, I whispered aloud, "Dan, I'm sorry." The silence around me felt profound, thick with an unspoken acceptance. There were no ghostly murmurs, no shadows stretching toward me, just the quiet, steady beat of my own heart and a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. In the days that followed, something shifted inside me. I felt lighter, as though a piece of myself that had been missing for so long had returned. The house, once a place of shadows and dread, became a space filled with warmth and light. I even found myself humming as I moved through the rooms, like a part of me had come alive again. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I thought I heard a faint whisper drift up from the living room. It was so soft, I almost missed it. "Thank you." The voice was calm, familiar, and filled with a gratitude that resonated deep within me. I felt a warmth settle over me, a quiet understanding that everything would be okay. And that was the last time I ever heard it. The house stayed silent after that, its shadows just shadows, its creaks just the ordinary groans of an old home. But I held on to the memory of that voice, knowing it was a part of me, a part I had finally learned to live with. Life went on, simple and steady, and I kept that journal on my bedside table as a reminder that sometimes the scariest shadows are just reflections of what we keep buried. And sometimes the voices we fear most are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. The sea has always had a strange pull on people like me. I joined the crew of the Sea Wanderer out of a need for something beyond land, for the open expanse of water where everything felt freer, rawer, where I could think without the noise of civilization pressing in on me. The ship was an older, sturdy vessel. Nothing fancy, just a solid cargo carrier with a half-dozen other men and a captain who was far more interested in his rum than any of us. We were about 4 weeks into a 6-week trip somewhere in the northern Atlantic when things started to get strange. It started innocently enough. One of the newer deckhands, Billy, mentioned that he'd seen something strange in the water one night. Said he thought he saw a shadow floating alongside the ship. I'd laughed it off, the way you do with these kinds of things. Billy was a kid, practically fresh off land, still getting his sea legs. A shadow? That could be anything. A piece of driftwood, a big fish, even a patch of seaweed if the light hit it right. The ocean is full of oddities, and not all of them need explaining. But the way he looked at me, there was something in his eyes. Not fear, exactly, but something close. A deep, unsettling discomfort that stuck with me. It wasn't until 3 nights later that I understood. That night, I was on watch. The sea was calm, eerily so. There wasn't much to do besides look out over the water, listen to the creaks of the ship, and watch the stars spread across the sky like scattered jewels. I'd always liked the night watch. There was something meditative about it. Just you, the ship, and the endless, quiet sea. But that night, it felt different. The air was heavy, almost pressing in around me, and there was a chill that cut right to the bone, even though it wasn't particularly cold. I chalked it up to the isolation and kept my eyes trained on the water. It was around 3 in the morning, the darkest part of the night, when I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape, barely visible on the water's surface. It floated maybe 10-20 feet off the side of the ship, keeping pace with us as we moved. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Could have been a large fish, or maybe a bit of debris floating along with the current. But it felt wrong. Too close, too intentional. The moonlight barely touched it, but enough filtered down that I could make out the edges of a shadow, darker than anything else around it. And it was moving with us. Not just floating randomly, following. I felt a chill run down my spine, my breath catching in my throat. It was ridiculous, I told myself. A grown man on the open sea, feeling spooked by a dark patch on the water? I've been doing this long enough to know better. But something about it made my skin crawl. I forced myself to turn away, trying to shake off the feeling. I told myself I was imagining things. But every time I glanced back, the shadow was there, gliding alongside us, perfectly in sync with the ship's movements. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it sank below the water, disappearing without a ripple. I stood there, staring out at the empty, dark surface of the ocean, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't mention it to anyone. I knew what they'd say. Too much time alone, maybe you're losing it. But that night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that dark shape, the way it had moved, the way it had looked up at me. Yes, looked up. Because that was the worst part. As ridiculous as it sounds, I had felt its eyes on me, a heavy, piercing gaze from beneath the water. The next night, I found myself on watch again. I almost dreaded going out there, but I told myself that it was just my imagination, a figment of my exhaustion. The seas were dark, endless, and full of strange things that could play tricks on the mind. But something had shifted inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent most of the night pacing the deck, glancing over the side more often than I wanted to admit. There was nothing there. The sea was dark and quiet, the waves lapping gently against the ship's hull. But I felt it. I could sense it. Something in the deep, something that knew I was there. It wasn't until just before dawn that it happened again. I had turned to head back toward the wheelhouse when I saw it, the shadow gliding alongside the ship once more. Only this time it was closer, maybe 10 feet away. My pulse quickened as I watched it, my hand tightening around the railing until my knuckles turned white. And then, as if sensing my gaze, the shadow shifted, tilting upward just enough that I could make out the faintest impression of something. Eyes, perhaps, or the suggestion of them. Dark, empty, and vast, like pits that led into some unfathomable abyss. The ship creaked, and in the dead silence of the early morning, I swear I heard a faint whisper, a sound like a breath, low and rasping, carrying a sense of cold detachment. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it was enough to make my heart race, to set every nerve on edge. I wanted to call out, to yell, to grab one of the crew, but I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, frozen as I watched that shadow drift, its gaze fixed on me, unblinking, as if studying me, like it was waiting for something. After what felt like an eternity, it sank beneath the waves again, slipping silently into the darkness below. I staggered back, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. The following days, I tried to keep myself busy, to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I told myself it was just exhaustion, maybe a bit of cabin fever. But I wasn't the only one who had noticed. Billy mentioned the shadow again, his voice trembling as he recounted seeing it off the starboard side, just after sunset. "I don't think it's a fish," he whispered, his face pale. "It's something else. Something... watching." I didn't know what to say. I could barely wrap my head around it myself, let alone reassure him. But in the following nights, more of the crew started seeing it. One by one, they caught glimpses of that shadow, drifting alongside the ship, always out of reach, always just close enough to be seen, but not understood. Each of us saw it in our own way. Some said it looked like a person, others thought it was a giant sea creature, but none of us could explain it. And with each sighting, the atmosphere on the ship grew heavier, the tension mounting as we all tried to pretend it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. On the last night of our voyage, the sea was dead calm. The air felt stifling, the weight of our silent fear pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. We were all on edge, jumpy and exhausted, waiting for whatever might come next. Just after midnight, I was on watch again, staring out over the rail, my mind buzzing with a mix of dread and anticipation. And then, I saw it. The shadow was back, but this time it was different. It wasn't drifting along beside us, watching passively. It was closer, rising from the depths with an almost predatory slowness. I could feel its gaze, sharper and more focused than ever, like a cold hand pressing against my chest. I backed away from the rail, my heart hammering as I realized it was getting closer, rising higher, its dark form expanding, taking shape. And then, in one horrifying moment, I saw it clearly. The shape was humanoid, but wrong. Its skin, if you could call it that, was slick and dark, glistening in the moonlight. Its limbs were too long, its fingers stretching out like tendrils, clawed and reaching. And its face, God, its face was blank, featureless, save for those empty pits where its eyes should have been. It reached up, one clawed hand stretching toward me, and I felt a cold, desperate terror seize me. It wasn't just looking at me, it was trying to reach me. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe, my legs shaking as I tripped over a coil of rope falling hard onto the deck. The sound must have broken some spell, because the figure stopped, its hand retracting, those empty eyes seeming to lose focus. And then, with a silent, sickening grace, it sank back into the water, disappearing without a sound. I sat there, gasping, my mind reeling, the image of that dark, twisted face seared into my memory. The rest of the trip passed in a haze. None of us spoke of the shadow, but we all knew. It was there, lurking beneath the surface, watching, waiting. And when we finally docked, we left that ship without looking back, each of us eager to set foot on solid ground, away from the endless, watching depths of the ocean. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Maybe it was some unknown creature of the deep, or maybe it was a manifestation of something darker, something that belonged to the sea and the secrets it holds. All I know is that the ocean has depths we're not meant to understand, and things that linger below, watching, waiting, always just out of sight. And sometimes on quiet nights when I'm alone, I feel that gaze again, a cold, silent reminder that the sea doesn't forget. And neither do I. You know, that kind of belief that if something's not in front of you, it doesn't exist. That was me, through and through. But that night, something changed. I still don't know how to explain it, and to be honest, sometimes I think I'd rather not. But let me take you back there, to the chill of that empty road, the weight of the dark, and the feeling that someone or something was watching. I'd been visiting my sister out near Silver City for a few days, helping her pack up for a move. It was an exhausting day, and I probably should have stayed the night, but I'd gotten a late call from my boss, practically begging me to get back for a last-minute meeting. I was tired but determined, convinced I could make the drive with enough coffee and loud music to keep me company. The highway cut through Arena's valley, and it was desolate, the kind of desolation you almost feel on your skin. Just miles and miles of flat, dry land stretching out on either side of the road, covered in low scrub and the occasional twisted tree. The sky was pitch black, with barely a handful of stars visible through the thick, low-hanging clouds. It wasn't stormy, but you could feel something heavy in the air, something unspoken. The clock read a little past midnight, and I had maybe an hour and a half more of driving. That's when I noticed it. Just out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving on the shoulder up ahead. I couldn't make it out at first, just a dark figure, faint and indistinct against the endless stretch of road. It wasn't close to the car, not exactly. It was hanging back, lingering just on the edge of my high beams. My heart kicked up a notch, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably a hitchhiker, I thought. But then, as quickly as I saw it, the figure was gone. I blinked, craning my neck to see if I could spot it again. There was nothing but empty road. My shoulders relaxed a bit, though that strange, heavy feeling didn't leave. A few miles later, I saw it again. This time it was closer, just a little farther down the road, still hanging back, shadowy and distorted. The shape was tall, with limbs that seemed almost too long, too thin. It was hard to make out, but my mind immediately screamed, wrong. Something about it didn't add up, didn't fit with any image of a person I could imagine. I shook my head, refusing to let myself get spooked. I took a deep breath, rolled down the window a crack, letting the cool desert air in, hoping it would clear my mind. But the smell that wafted in was stale and sharp, a smell like burned wood or something decaying, which sent an unexpected chill through me. Trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine, I turned up the volume on my radio. It crackled and sputtered, though, the static filling the car with a kind of oppressive silence. I tried switching channels, but no luck. Every frequency was just static. That's when I felt it again, that feeling of being watched. You know when you can just tell someone's eyes are on you? Like heat pricking along the back of your neck. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing. I glanced back at the road and saw it again, that same tall, gaunt figure, except this time it was in the middle of the road, right in my path. I slammed the brakes, tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. My headlights shone on the road ahead, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a face. Pale, featureless, just two hollow eye sockets staring back at me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, and then it was gone. Just like that, poof, I was left staring at an empty stretch of highway. I took a deep, shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were sweating, my mind racing. Maybe I'm just overtired, I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. I'd driven this stretch of road plenty of times and never seen anything weird before. Maybe exhaustion and the darkness were just getting to me. I gathered myself, took a sip of water, and slowly inched the car forward. The radio was still static, so I turned it off entirely, letting the quiet press in around me. All I could hear was the low hum of the engine and the faint whine of the wind outside. It was dead quiet, too quiet, even for a place like this. I drove on for another mile, maybe two, my eyes scanning the road, the landscape, anything that could reassure me it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That chill hadn't left. If anything, it was getting worse. The desert seemed to close in tighter around me, and the shadows cast by my headlights seemed to twist and writhe, like they were alive, crawling across the sand. Suddenly my car began to sputter, jolting me out of my daze. The gas light was on, which was impossible. I'd filled up just before I left my sister's place. I glanced at the gauge, watching the needle plummet towards empty. Then, with a final, shuddering gasp, the engine cut off, and the car rolled to a stop. I sat there, in stunned silence, as the darkness pressed in from all sides. Without the headlights, the world was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, but when I looked at the screen, I saw that it was dead. No signal, no light, nothing. A prickling sense of dread crawled over my skin as I realized just how alone I was. A rational part of me knew it could be a coincidence, that cars break down, that phones die. But the fear that was seeping into me wasn't rational. I stepped out of the car, my shoes crunching on the gravel. The desert was silent, except for a faint whisper of wind, and that smell was back, stronger now, thick, like smoke and rot. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself, as I looked around, trying to orient myself, to figure out what to do. That's when I saw it again, the figure. It was standing on the other side of the car now, close enough that I could see the outline of its limbs, spindly and twisted, the head cocked to one side as though watching me. I stumbled back, my throat dry as I tried to form words, but no sound came out. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into me, like it was searching for something, something deep inside me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place. My mind was screaming at me to get back in the car, to lock the doors, but I couldn't move. And then, slowly, it lifted one hand, a hand with fingers long and thin, like bones barely covered in skin, and pointed toward the desert. I don't know what possessed me to follow its gesture, but I looked out across the sand, my eyes scanning the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the same empty scrubland. But then a flash of light caught my eye, a soft, flickering glow off in the distance, maybe a quarter-mile away. I took a step, then another, as if in a trance, my feet moving without my permission. The figure stayed in place, its hand still pointing toward that light, urging me forward. I don't remember how long I walked, just that with every step the glow got brighter, until I could make out the faint shape of an old shack, half buried in the sand. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, stepping into the dim interior. The air was thick and stale, filled with that same smell of rot and decay, but stronger, almost suffocating. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to look around. The shack was empty, except for an old wooden chair in the middle of the room. There was something lying on it, a bundle wrapped in frayed, dusty cloth. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but something compelled me to reach out, to peel back the layers of fabric. Inside was a small, weathered journal, the pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it, scanning the scrawled handwriting, my hands shaking as I read. The entries described strange sightings on the highway, people vanishing, odd figures lingering at the edges of the road. The final entry sent a chill through my veins. If you see it, it already knows you. If you follow, you'll never come back. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that I'd been following it all along, led like a puppet on a string. I looked up, and in the shadows by the door, I saw the figure again, closer than ever, its hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking. In a blind panic, I bolted, sprinting back through the desert toward my car. My lungs burned, my heart pounded, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel it behind me, closing the distance, that unbearable smell filling the air around me. I reached the car, threw myself inside, and slammed the door, locking it with shaking hands. For what felt like hours, I sat there, breathless and trembling, until finally the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I turned the key and miraculously, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was still there, watching me. I drove straight through to the next town and never returned to Arena's Valley. But every now and then, in the dead of night, I'll catch a glimpse of something dark just on the edge of my vision, or feel that same chill down my spine, as if those hollow eyes are watching, waiting, reminding me that it isn't over. When I moved with my 3-year-old daughter Mira to a small, ancient village in England, I thought we were starting a new chapter. After my husband passed unexpectedly, I wanted a fresh start somewhere quiet, somewhere filled with history. So when I saw the listing for a charming, ivy-covered cottage that locals called Hollow House, I took it as a sign. It was perfect, or so I thought. The house was as picturesque as it was hauntingly beautiful. It was everything you'd imagine from an old English cottage. Weathered stone walls, a moss-covered roof, and tall, narrow windows that seemed to peer out at the world with secrets buried deep. It was the kind of place that had seen centuries of life and death and everything in between. From the moment we arrived, Mira seemed drawn to the house in an odd way. She would wander through the hallways, her little fingers tracing the worn wood, eyes wide as if absorbing the place. But one night, a few days after we moved in, she came into my room looking unsettled, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny. "Mommy," she whispered, eyes wide. "There's a man in the hallway." I brushed her hair back, assuming it was just nerves or an overactive imagination. She'd been through a lot, and I told myself that maybe the new surroundings were making her uneasy. "Oh, honey, you probably just saw a shadow," I reassured her, pulling her into my arms. But Mira shook her head emphatically. No, Mommy, it's a man with a bad face. His eyes are all wrong. Her little fingers traced circles around her own eyes, as if trying to make sense of what she'd seen. I'll admit, her words sent a slight chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. Kids have wild imaginations, right? I hugged her close, told her everything was fine, and tucked her back into bed. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed unnaturally quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. The wind outside had picked up, and every creak, every rustle of branches seemed amplified in the dead silence. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, old timber groaning against the night air, but a gnawing unease started to grow. A week passed without any other incidents, and I started to relax. Mira didn't mention the man again, and I began to believe it was just a child's fear of the unfamiliar. But then, one evening as I was making dinner, Mira appeared in the kitchen doorway, staring at me with a somber look on her face. "He's back, Mommy," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. My heart sank. "Where did you see him, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She pointed toward the dark hallway leading to the stairs. "He's there, right there. He just stands there, staring." She paused, looking down. "He has bad eyes." Her words rattled me, but I couldn't see anything. Still, her fear was palpable, and I decided to take it seriously, if only for her peace of mind. That night, I went online and ordered a couple of security cameras. Just simple ones I could set up around the house to give Mira some reassurance, and maybe calm my own nerves too. The cameras arrived a few days later, and I installed one in the hallway and another facing Mira's room. I didn't expect to see anything unusual. I just thought that being able to say we had monitored the house would calm Mira. For the first few nights, things were quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then on the fourth night, I heard it. A sound so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. Heavy breathing, slow and steady, filling the silence. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. I lay still, listening, my own breath shallow as the sound faded into the quiet. The next morning I reviewed the footage, feeling almost ridiculous as I sat there, eyes bleary, staring at the tiny screen. But as I scrubbed through the hours of recording, my heart dropped. Around midnight, on the camera in the hallway, a shadow appeared, dark and indistinct. At first it seemed like a trick of the light, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately, like someone pacing just beyond the reach of the lens. I rewound, watching again, my heart hammering. There was no mistaking it. The shadow was moving down the hall toward Mira's room. I felt a surge of protectiveness and horror. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, yet there it was, plain as day. I closed my laptop, my mind racing, trying to decide what to do. The idea of leaving had crossed my mind, but something in me refused to be chased out. This was our home now, and I needed to understand what was happening. I started to dig into the history of Hollow House, researching online and asking around town. The locals were friendly enough, but the moment I mentioned the house, their expressions changed and conversations grew clipped. I got the sense that they were uncomfortable, almost as if talking about it might conjure up whatever lingered there. Eventually, I found an old newspaper article about a soldier from the 1400s who was rumored to haunt the area. He had died in a brutal skirmish nearby, his body never properly buried. According to legend, his spirit was trapped, doomed to wander until someone acknowledged his presence. Or so the story went. They called him the Hollow Man. The tale seemed absurd at first, but after what Mira had described and what I'd seen on the camera, I couldn't ignore the eerie parallels. His bad eyes started to make sense, the way Mira described him. Soldiers in those days often wore primitive helmets, which could cast eerie shadows over their faces, and the battlefield injuries were horrific. I felt a chill down my spine. It was one thing to read ghost stories. It was another to feel like you were living in one. That night, I decided to leave the cameras running again, with the volume turned up. I wanted to confront this, to face whatever was lurking in my home. Around midnight, the breathing started again, this time louder and more distinct. I sat up in bed, listening, my pulse racing. Slowly, I pulled up the camera feed on my phone. The hallway was empty, but I could hear it, clear as day, through the speaker. A deep, labored breathing, like someone struggling to draw breath. Then a faint, barely their voice. I couldn't make out the words at first, but as I turned up the volume, my blood ran cold. Help. Me. The voice was guttural, hoarse, like someone choking out their last breaths. I could feel the weight of those words, a kind of desperation that made my heart ache. But before I could process what I was hearing, something dark crossed the camera view. A figure, tall and gaunt, just at the edge of the hallway, then gone in a flash. My body froze, my mind racing. I was terrified, but knew I couldn't just ignore it. So, I took a deep breath, grabbed the flashlight from my bedside, and walked toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the air grew colder as I approached. When I reached the hall, I flicked on the flashlight and swept it over the walls. The beam caught something scratched into the wall near the baseboard, faint but unmistakable. Restless. Forgotten. My breath hitched. It was as if the words had been clawed into the wall, the markings jagged and desperate. In that moment, I understood. The spirit wasn't trying to harm us. It was trying to be remembered, to be freed. Mira had seen him because children are sensitive to things adults ignore, things we're taught to brush off. I realized then that I couldn't just pack up and leave. This wasn't something that would disappear if I ignored it. The next day, I reached out to a local historian and shared what I'd found. He agreed to help me perform a simple ritual to lay the spirit to rest, something respectful, acknowledging his suffering and giving him the closure he'd been denied. We gathered at dawn by the house, near a spot where an old well once stood. The historian recited a few lines, simple words of remembrance and peace, as I held Mira close. For a moment there was silence, a stillness so deep it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. And then, as if in response, a warm breeze rustled through the air, and I felt something lift, a heaviness I hadn't even realized was weighing on me. From that day on, the house felt different. The shadows seemed softer, the nights quieter. Mira never mentioned the man with the bad face again, and I haven't heard the breathing since. But sometimes in the early hours of dawn, I'll feel a gentle warmth in the hallway, almost like a silent thank you, a reminder that we'd given someone the peace they'd longed for. After that ritual, life returned to a strange kind of normal in Hollow House. For a while it felt like the air had finally cleared, like the weight I'd been feeling since we moved in had been lifted. Mira went back to her usual joyful self, no longer whispering about the man in the hallway. I thought we'd found peace. But as I've learned, peace doesn't always last. A few months later, during a chilly November evening, Mira came to me again, looking uneasy. This time, she didn't say anything about seeing a man with bad eyes or a scary face. She simply took my hand and asked, "Mommy, who's the sad lady?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean, Mira?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was racing. Mira pointed toward the staircase, where shadows from the flickering fireplace danced up the walls. "She's there sometimes. She sits at the bottom of the stairs and cries. I hear her at night," Mira whispered, her big eyes filled with concern. For a moment I felt frozen. I wanted to dismiss it as just another child's imagination running wild, but after what had happened with the hollow man, I wasn't so sure. I knelt down and looked into Mira's eyes. "Can you tell me what she looks like, sweetie?" Mira seemed to think for a moment, then said, "She has long hair and a white dress, and she's always sad. She looks like she's waiting for someone." Those words hung heavy in the air. I forced a smile, hugging Mira close. "Thank you for telling me, honey. Why don't you go color for a bit while I finish up here?" After Mira wandered off, I stared at the staircase, watching the shadows flicker, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, a gnawing sense of dread started to creep back. It had been months since I felt anything unusual in the house, and I'd let my guard down. I had assumed we'd laid all the spirits to rest. That night, I lay in bed, waiting, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to a faint sound, the unmistakable sound of soft, heart-wrenching sobs. They were so faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but undeniably there. I sat up, holding my breath, listening. The sound was coming from the stairs. Every instinct in me told me to stay in bed, to ignore it, but my feet moved on their own. I wrapped a thick sweater around myself, bracing against the draft that seemed to linger around the staircase, and slowly made my way down. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I caught sight of her, a faint figure, sitting on the last step, her head bent low as she wept, her long hair falling over her face like a veil. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and even though she was barely more than a shadow in the dim light, I could feel her despair as if it were my own. "Hello," I said softly, my voice trembling. The sobbing stopped abruptly, and the figure slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes filled with sorrow so deep it seemed endless. She stared at me, unblinking, as if waiting for something, as if hoping I held the answer to her grief. I took a shaky breath, trying to keep my composure. Can I help you?" I whispered, the words almost catching in my throat. Her lips parted, and in a voice that was barely a whisper, she said, "I can't find him. My love, I've waited so long." A wave of sadness washed over me, and somehow I understood. She was searching, longing, and had been for centuries. She must have been a part of the house's past, a woman left behind, bound to Hollow House by an unfulfilled promise, a lover who never returned. I wanted to help, to give her peace as I had the Hollow Man, but I didn't know where to start. "Tell me his name," I said softly, hoping it would offer her some comfort. "Maybe I can help you find him." Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head, almost as if trying to remember something that had slipped away. "I don't know," she whispered. "He was taken from me, so long ago." Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, her figure began to fade, dissolving into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of her sorrow. Over the following days, I threw myself into researching Hollow House's history again, scouring old records for any mention of a lost woman, of an ill-fated couple separated by war or tragedy. I even reached out to the historian who had helped with the Hollow Man, and together we dug deeper than ever before. We finally uncovered a story about a young woman named Eleanor who had lived in the area in the 1400s. She'd been engaged to a local soldier, but he was called to fight in a battle and never returned. Heartbroken, Eleanor had stayed in her family home, what is now Hollow House, waiting for her fiancé to return, until she died alone many years later. It felt like everything clicked into place. The Hollow Man, that ghostly soldier, must have been her fiancé, the very man Eleanor had waited for all those years. They had both been bound to the house, each trapped by their longing for one another. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared a small ritual similar to the one we'd performed for the soldier, but this time with 2 candles, one for him and one for her. I gathered a few wildflowers from the garden, imagining them as a final, symbolic offering between the lovers who had waited so long to be reunited. That evening, as dusk settled over the house, I placed the candles at the foot of the staircase. I whispered a prayer of peace and release, asking for their reunion, for their love to finally find its way out of the shadows and into the light. As the last candle flickered, I felt a warmth envelop the hallway, a feeling of release, as if an old, weary presence was lifting away. And then, just before the flame went out, I heard it, a faint sigh, a whisper of gratitude carried through the room like a soft breeze. Since that night, the house has been silent, truly silent. No more shadows lurking in the hallways, no more cries or breathing in the dark. The house feels peaceful, almost as if it has exhaled a long-held breath. Sometimes, though, I'll sit at the bottom of the stairs and feel a quiet sense of warmth, a gentle reassurance, as if the spirits who once lingered here have found their way, finally together, wherever they were meant to be. And while Hollow House will always hold echoes of the past, I know that those echoes have found peace. I didn't think much of working late shifts when I first started my job at the mall. Sure, it wasn't the most glamorous job, but I liked it well enough, and the extra money helped. I always thought of myself as a careful person too. I mean, I wasn't the kind to wander off in strange places or walk around without a sense of my surroundings. But sometimes, things happen that you just don't see coming. It was late January, the dead of winter, and I remember that day so clearly. I'd finished my shift at a small clothing store in the mall. It was one of those nights where you feel the cold down to your bones. The wind was bitter, whistling through the empty corridors as the mall cleared out. Most of the stores were closed by the time I clocked out, and I was one of the last employees left. I wrapped myself up in my scarf and coat, tucking my hands deep into my pockets as I headed for the bus stop, about a 10-minute walk from the mall's main entrance. The route was quiet, as it usually was late at night. There were just a couple of people in the parking lot, probably loading up before heading home. Halfway there, I noticed someone ahead, a man standing by the bus stop. He looked a little out of place. He wasn't dressed for the weather at all, just a thin jacket and no hat, no gloves, nothing. But I told myself maybe he was just waiting for the same bus. It wasn't that unusual. I kept my head down, trying to avoid eye contact, hoping he'd ignore me. But as I got closer, he turned, looking right at me. He was tall, maybe in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and a strange, fixed smile that felt wrong. Like it was there out of habit, not because he was happy. He started to walk toward me, slowly at first, and I could feel my stomach tighten. He kept glancing around, as if checking to see if anyone else was watching. "Hey there!" he called out, his voice oddly cheerful for the late hour. I forced myself to nod, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone, but he didn't. Instead, he closed the gap between us and stopped just a couple of feet away. "Late night for you, huh?" he asked, eyes flicking up and down, taking in every detail. I could feel his gaze like it was crawling over me. "Yeah, just got off work," I replied, hoping my tone sounded polite but firm. I didn't want to come off as rude, but something about him made my skin crawl. "You're a pretty young girl," he said, still smiling. "How old are you?" My heart started to race, and I tried to stay calm. 18, I answered, my voice barely a whisper, as I took a small step back. I didn't want to seem scared, but my instincts were screaming at me to get away. "Perfect age," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He tilted his head as if studying me. "You know, I work for a place, a studio, actually. They could use someone like you. You could make some good money, probably more than whatever you're making here." "It's nothing shady," he added, seeing the look on my face. "Just modeling." I felt my skin prickle with unease. Modeling? It sounded like a rehearsed line, like he'd said it 1,000 times before. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks, but I'm not really interested. I'm just waiting for my bus." His smile faltered, and for a moment his eyes turned cold. "You sure?" he asked, taking a step closer. "You could do well for yourself. Don't you want to get out of this dead-end job?" My heart was pounding now, but I managed to say, "I'm really not interested, thanks." I took a quick glance around. The streets were deserted. There wasn't a soul in sight. I felt exposed, like the world had shrunk to just him and me, and there was no one to turn to. I could feel his gaze, persistent and unyielding, as I shuffled nervously, glancing toward the mall. That's when he moved closer, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "Look, why don't you just come check out the studio? You'll be fine. It's close by, and I can take you there right now." My stomach flipped, and I took another step back, my legs nearly tripping over themselves. "No, I'm good, really. My bus will be here soon." For a moment he just stood there, his face unreadable. Then, in a soft, almost menacing tone, he said, "You really shouldn't turn down an opportunity when it's handed to you, kid." At that moment, instinct took over. I turned and bolted back toward the mall, feeling the cold air bite against my face as I sprinted across the parking lot. I didn't look back, but I could sense him following, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I could hear my own breath, coming fast and shallow as I ran through the sliding glass doors of the mall entrance and right into the brightly lit jewelry store near the entrance. The woman behind the counter looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. I must have looked a mess, wide-eyed and panicked. "Can I help you?" she asked, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. I think someone's following me," I managed to say between breaths. "Can I just stay here for a minute?" She nodded quickly, guiding me behind the counter. "Of course, Han. You're safe here." As I stood there trying to calm down, I glanced out the store's glass front. The man had stopped just outside the mall entrance, pacing back and forth like he was waiting for me to come back out. The sight of him sent a fresh wave of fear through me. The woman noticed my reaction and came over, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Do you want me to call security?" "Yes, please," I whispered, clutching the counter for support. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. I watched him through the glass, his eyes still searching, scanning the mall entrance like a predator stalking prey. Within minutes, a security guard appeared, and I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I watched as the man outside caught sight of the guard and quickly turned, walking away into the night without a backward glance. But that image of his retreating figure under the dim streetlight, that menacing smile he'd given me, was burned into my memory. The guard escorted me to my bus when it finally arrived, and I was too shaken to explain the whole story. I just thanked him, got on the bus, and tried to focus on getting home. For the next few weeks, I was jumpy, watching over my shoulder every time I went to the bus stop. Eventually, the memory faded, though it never fully went away. I stopped mentioning it, even to myself, convincing myself that maybe he was just some creep, nothing more. But then, about 2 months later, I was sitting at home watching the news when I felt the blood drain from my face. They were showing a mugshot of a man announcing his arrest. It was him, the man from the bus stop. The reporter was detailing his charges: attempted kidnapping, trafficking, targeting vulnerable girls at bus stops and malls, using promises of modeling opportunities to lure them. He'd already managed to lure 2 young girls, both underage, and had been linked to an international trafficking ring. I felt sick, a wave of horror washing over me as I realized how close I'd come to something I couldn't even fully comprehend. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the image of his face, that calculated, predatory smile, his eyes fixed on me. I knew that I'd gotten lucky, that running had probably saved me from an unimaginable fate. After seeing his face on the news, I didn't feel safe for a long time. I kept replaying that night over and over in my mind, each time feeling the same gut-wrenching fear. It wasn't just that I had narrowly escaped. It was knowing that other girls like me, maybe even younger, hadn't been as lucky. They'd fallen into his trap, believing the promises, trusting the fake smile. And that thought haunted me. For weeks, I couldn't go anywhere alone. Every time I left the house, I felt like someone was watching, like a shadow lurked in every corner. It didn't help that I started seeing him in my dreams. Dark, twisted nightmares where I'd be standing alone at the bus stop, and he'd appear, slowly closing the distance between us with that same, unreadable smile. I'd try to run, but my feet would feel glued to the ground, and he'd get closer and closer, reaching out until I'd wake up in a cold sweat. One night, I was back at work, helping close up the store. It had been a few months since the arrest, and I was slowly starting to get my confidence back. I was working with Ellie, one of my co-workers, who was also 18, and we'd become pretty close over the past few months. She was always joking and laughing, a little bit of lightness in an otherwise heavy time for me. As we were cleaning up, Ellie mentioned she had to take the bus home that night. I froze for a second, feeling my stomach twist. "You're taking the bus?" "It's so late, Ellie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She laughed. "It's not like there's any other option, right? I'll be fine." She paused, catching the look on my face. "Hey, are you okay?" I hesitated, then told her the whole story, every detail. The man, the bus stop, the way he'd tried to lure me, and how I'd only found out months later who he really was. I hadn't told many people about it, but I wanted her to understand why I was so scared for her. When I finished, she just looked at me, her face serious. "Wow, I can't believe that happened to you," she whispered. "That's terrifying." "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "Please, just be careful, Ellie. It's not worth the risk." She nodded, and we finished closing up in silence. But when we stepped out into the cold night air, a chill ran down my spine. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 1 or 2 cars left, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they pulled out. Ellie gave me a quick hug and promised to text when she got home. As I watched her walk away toward the bus stop, something in me snapped. I couldn't let her go alone, not after everything I'd been through. I jogged up behind her. "Hey," I said, slightly out of breath. "Why don't I wait with you?" She looked surprised but smiled gratefully. "Thanks, that'd be nice." We stood together at the bus stop, the street lights casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem amplified, every shadow seem a little more sinister. I tried to chat, to keep things light, but the unease in my stomach grew with each passing second. A few minutes later, I noticed a car slowing down as it passed us. It was an old sedan, its headlights dimmed as it crawled by. The driver's window rolled down just a crack. I couldn't make out the face inside, but I felt their eyes on us. The car continued down the road, only to turn around at the corner and come back, driving even slower this time. I felt my heart start to race. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to scare Ellie, but I couldn't help the fear building up. All the memories from that night came flooding back, the way the man had watched me, followed me. When the car passed us a third time, Ellie noticed too. She looked at me, her eyes wide. Do you think they're watching us?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I nodded, keeping my voice low. "Let's head back to the mall entrance, okay? We'll be safer there." She didn't argue. Together we turned and walked quickly back toward the mall, glancing over our shoulders every few steps. The car had pulled over on the side of the road now, the engine idling as the driver continued to watch us. I could feel their gaze, and my stomach turned with dread. I had been through this before, and I knew I couldn't ignore the signs. As we reached the mall entrance, Ellie pulled out her phone. "Maybe I should call my brother to pick me up," she muttered, her hands shaking as she tapped his number. The car suddenly revved its engine and sped off, disappearing into the night, but the fear lingered. We stayed there, standing close to the glass doors, both of us on edge. I didn't realize how tense I was until I felt my whole body relax slightly as I saw her brother's car pull into the lot. Ellie gave me a hug, her face still pale. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." I just nodded, too shaken to respond. As I watched her drive off, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I had escaped once, maybe even twice. But I couldn't help wondering how many more times I'd come across people like that, people lurking in the dark, waiting for an opportunity. Now, whenever I tell this story, I can see the horror and disbelief on people's faces. It's as if they don't want to believe it, as if they can't imagine something like that happening in real life. But it does. And it can happen to anyone.